as you know, the CIHE is based out of the University of Toronto in Ontario. And so I just want to acknowledge the land on which our university currently operates. So for thousands of years, it's been the place of, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. And we're very grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. And we're all from everywhere. We're all from different places, as we've seen in the chat, which is excellent. It's good that we can do this on a more international basis these days. So for today's chat, I'm going to hand it over to you guys. So our excellent speakers this week are going to talk to us about the diversity of distance doctoral cohorts. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'll hand it over to you then, Katrina. Take it away.
Thank you, Alison. It's really lovely to be here and very much appreciate that land acknowledgement. I'm calling in from New Zealand, where we also, have a history of land confiscation and theft and a complex kind of settlement process. So it's lovely to have that kind of shared beginning and something that you clearly value as well. So it's lovely to be here with my colleagues. Emma and Jamie are here, and we're hoping that Liezel might make it along, but she's got some internet issues in South Africa. We are a research team that's been looking at distance doctorates, and you see we've got distance in kind of air quotes there. We're going to spend some time thinking about what that even means. So we're going to share some early insights from our research into who distance doctoral students even are and what distance looks like these days, and maybe busting open some of the categories that we might initially think about. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Emma was a summer research scholar, and so I'd really like to thank the University of Waikato who provided funding for Emma, who's an undergraduate student, to work for us full-time for 10 weeks over the summer, getting some really valuable research experience and contributing kind of woman power to move our project along in lots of practical ways. Jamie is an assistant professor at the University of Warwick in the UK, and Liezel is a professor and the head of a similar kind of centre for research in higher education at Stellenbosch in South Africa. We're all on Twitter, and our project hashtag is distance doctorates, so you can kind of search for that and it'll pull up a feed of what we've been doing and talking about until now, but you'll also get lots of a sense of that from our presentations today. So thank you so much for your interest and for being here. We would welcome questions and comments. Feel free to chuck things in the chat as we go along, and then we'll deal with them at the end. So Jamie, over to you.
Thanks, Katrina. Hi, everybody. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. So today, this is a bit of a roadmap of what we're planning to talk about. We're going to start with Katrina and I sharing a little bit about the places that we're speaking from, our own experiences, which have drawn us to this area of study. Then we're going to spend a bit of time, as Katrina noted, thinking about what the distance part of distance doctoral education might mean. What does distance education mean these days in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and other moves toward remote work? We'll then move on to introducing our project, telling you a little bit more about what we've been doing, and then we'll go through some key areas that we wanted to share with you. So we'll spend a bit of time thinking about how we might understand today's distance doctoral students, how we might think about distance modes in relation to equity, diversity, and inclusion considerations, and also share some early impressions from the data, as well as some ways to keep up with our project. We'd love to keep in touch. So do you want me to start here, Katrina, and then I'll hand over to you? Okay. So I think it's helpful for Katrina and I to just spend a little bit of time telling you where this project comes from for us. We both have experiences with distance doctoral education. and that is something that sort of shapes our inquiry here. It's certainly motivated our interest in understanding the experiences of other students who study remotely. So in terms of my experience, you can see me here, happy with my supervisor on graduation day. I did my PhD in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I was studying in Auckland, at Auckland University, which was a city that I've never lived in. I began studying my PhD while I was working at a student support centre in Otago, then moved to Christchurch, which is also in the South Island, to care for a relative, ended up following a partner and getting a job and moving to Thailand. So I've had a lot of moves during my PhD. I had a lot of variations in terms of my candidature, from full-time to part-time to leaves of absence to all kinds of variations. And at times I was in a full-time care role for an unwell parent. At other times I was in a full-time academic role, and my PhD in total involved 7 house moves, which I do not advise. So I guess by sharing this, I just wanted to sort of give a bit of context to where this project sort of fits in my own story and what drew Katrina and I to start thinking about this and then bringing in other colleagues. So Katrina, did you want to share a bit more about your story?
Yes, well, before I do though, just to note that Jamie's beautiful supervisor there, Barbara, is going to be speaking in this series in just a few weeks. So register for her talk. It's going to be awesome. I've signed up. My distance doctoral experience also involved way too many houses. I lived in 6 different houses. So Jamie's got one more, but it's not good. But I think one of our hunches and the survey, as you'll see, is confirming, is that distance doctoral students live really complicated lives and a lot of stuff happens. You can't pause the uncertainties and shifts and busyness of life while doing a doctorate. So I did mine over 5 years, but took basically a year of that off when I had my first baby. So a baby in the middle of a doctorate, very common experience for women. I was in the Middle East when I first started. I was part of education reform work in Abu Dhabi, and then moved back to New Zealand. Partway through, I had 4 different jobs. For most of the time I was working full-time, not on my PhD, but in my paid job. Then at the end, after we moved back to New Zealand, for those last couple of years, I just did part-time employment and part-time PhD stuff to get it finished. That's my PhD baby that I'm cuddling there. And the graduation photo, that was the very first time I ever set foot on my university campus, was the day I picked up those robes and walked across that stage. So it was about as distance as you can get. And really it was reflecting on my distance experience that was the genesis for this project. I was part of a group of students over in the Middle East. My university came to the Middle East recruiting as part of an Australian government scheme whereby New Zealand and Australian students could do fees-free doctorates with Australian universities. So they talked about, we're really good at distance doctoral provision. This is what we do. We've got the biggest doctoral ed program in this area in the world. Come and study with us. But really what that played out as was my one supervisor carrying everything, rather than the institution contributing to supporting any of us as distance doctoral students. So I'd get increasingly irritated as I got email after email after email inviting me to participate in seminars and workshops and networking events and training that were all happening in person, on campus, in a country I wasn't in a time zone I wasn't in, with no provision or recognition that a whole lot of students might not be there or in that time zone or able to access that. So after a while, reached out to Jamie and said, hey, you did your doctorate by distance, didn't you? And we had a bit of a chat and the project, would you be interested in doing something in this space? And then we reached out to a couple of colleagues. So Liezel researches doctoral supervision in particular, And we've also worked with Chin Koo, who's from Australia. She's a researcher developer at La Trobe University, and she is stepping down a little bit at the moment, but she was really key in shaping our project, our proposal, and the research itself. So that's our backgrounds. What is distance then? It can be being really far away like I was, but I think these days we need to question that whether that's the only way that distance might look. Distance isn't a new thing, that's for sure. Distance education has been discussed in lots of levels of education for like 100 years, and in doctoral education for 25 years or so. And it's been part of that massification of graduate education. And usually we're thinking about students who are located somewhere else and who have minimal face-to-face presence at the university campus. But sometimes we associate that term distance with quite a simplistic, these are all of the overseas students. And it's a bit more complex than that. And so we just want to trouble that term distance a little bit and make sure that we're thinking broadly and understanding the whole range of who that term really encompasses. So we can see how it's shifted over time. I did some distance undergraduate study, and it was this postal correspondence business. I'd get a big packet in the mail of all of the printed out readings and activities and instructions. There was no interaction with any of my lecturers. Post off your assignment later. And then in the digital era, universities really embraced that, and we've had all of these online teaching modes. And so we do have fully online doctorates. We have flexi hybrid kind of doctorates. We have students who do some of their work digitally and some face-to-face, and we have supervisors who may not also be based on campus and who harness those digital modes to be able to communicate and interact with their colleagues and their supervisees. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, which really helped shift wider social norms around what work looks like. And people realised that some of the things that we had taken for granted about always going into the office and that always being the best and only way to do things, that was suddenly up for debate, I think, not just in higher education, but in just the workforce in general. And people are thinking about their benefits and the appeal of working from home sometimes, whether that's, the sustainability, less traffic, less carbon emissions and the transport to work, more productivity, focused time, balancing, interacting time with head down on my own time. And then obviously all of the forced moves to remote working, people who hadn't signed up to be a distance doctoral student, a distance supervisor, a distance anything, and had to figure out how to do this from home because they were locked down in quarantine, campuses were closed and those kinds of things. And it's been a really interesting accelerator, or it's opened up more people's thinking about what might be possible. And so I think that's one of the reasons that this project is quite timely, because we could now just work really hard to go back to what was before, but we might want to think a little bit more deliberately about that. And I'm sure you all are already, in reflecting on your own work patterns, whether you're a doctoral student or a supervisor or in whatever other role, thinking about that agency and choice about how we can work. So distance is no longer such a clean category, just of everybody who's overseas or everybody who is in a lockdown. And this is where we think an equity lens is really important. Distance education as a whole has always been about this bridge and a kind of enabler for people to access education, back from its beginnings with, adults who hadn't completed school, like primary and secondary school, doing distance programs to catch up. That's an equity intervention. And so we think that distance doctoral students should be considered through a similar kind of equity lens, because our distance can be a really important enabler for people who couldn't engage in doctoral research any other ways. And we've got research on some of those groups, people who are working So there was no question that I would ever do a full-time doctorate. I was working full-time. If I was ever going to do further study, of course it would be by distance, and it would be part-time. Often that part-time and distance nexus, that they kind of go together as these bridging pathways. People with caring responsibilities, as both Jamie's and my story illustrate, whether that's caring for a parent, a family member, or a child. Students also often have to travel away from where they're usually based to do their field work, and so that's a period of being at a distance. And then there are obviously people who don't have access to doctoral education where they currently live, whether there's no doctoral education at all, or there's not provision in their subject area, or they particularly want or need to work with a particular research group or supervisor, and they might be unable or just unwilling to relocate because other things in their lives, family, job, partner's job, kids' education, financial considerations, extended family and care responsibilities may just make that not an option. And then, of course, people who might be in lockdowns, in hospitals, and people do doctorates from jail. I'm trying to find out if anyone's ever done their doctorate in space, because there's all of these really, astronauts, a lot of them have doctor something in front of their name. So they value this higher education. And I want to know if anybody's worked on their doctorate up in space. This is my hunch, because people do doctorates in all of these environments. And if they didn't have a distance pathway, that wouldn't be possible. So the existence of distance is really important for allowing these people to engage in doctoral study, but that means, access without support is not really inclusion. So just because I was able to enroll in a distance program didn't mean I had access to all of the support and provision that an on-campus student would have had. And we argue that it's time to have a bit of a review of that and think about how we can configure provision that works for all of our students, rather than designing for our full-time on-campus students and then either not meeting the needs of distance students quite as well, or leaving the responsibility with them to make the best of it. And that's where our project comes in. Jamie.
All right, thanks, Katrina. So I'm just going to outline a little bit about what we've been doing in regards to our project so far. So here are our shiny faces, and this is our project team. So far we have developed a website with resources for distance doctoral students, and you can see the link there. It's got a number of resources that you could point any students who might be doing distance doctoral study to. We also have helped to create a Facebook community group to connect distance doctoral researchers. These researchers come from a range of disciplines, country contexts, and they're from all around the world. And what's really beautiful to see is that this group, while we sort of created the space, it's been populated by distance students who are taking it in their own direction and doing what they need to with this group. And so it's been really wonderful to see. In addition to this, we have conducted a research study focusing on the barriers, opportunities, strategies, and successes related to doctoral research by distance. And we'll be presenting some early findings from that research study today. And we're also in the process, I guess we could say, Katrina, we have drafted a book at this stage, which is provisionally titled Doctoral Research by Distance, Navigating Off-Campus, Online, Hybrid and Cross-National Doctoral Study. So this is a book aimed at students and is kind of going to take our research project and try and translate that to a student reader. So that's what we've got on the plate at the moment, but today we'll be focusing on our introducing you to our research study. All right, so what have we been doing? So in 2022, we launched a survey, and what we hoped to do with the survey was to capture the perspectives of those who recently completed or are currently undertaking doctoral research by distance. And as you can see on the screen here, this is a tweet put out by Chin, one of our colleagues on the project. This tweet went out online and we shared it across, multiple networks, listservs, that kind of thing, to try and get the word out for people to participate in our study. In terms of our project, distance doctoral students included those who may be officially enrolled by distance, but we also sought to capture the experiences of a wider array of people who might be engaging in all kinds of modes of doctoral study. So that might be off-campus, online, flexible, hybrid, cross-national. We were really interested in basically in people who don't routinely study on campus, in order to sort of probe at the edges of what distance might mean for doctoral students today. In terms of the participants, they had to be enrolled in or have recently completed a doctorate, and if they'd already completed their doctorate, we included students with a graduation date no earlier than 2015. Participants were all over 18 years of age, and as I said, the survey was distributed over listservs on social media and through our personal contacts. In total, we had 521 respondents from 42 countries, and as you'll see in just a moment, from really diverse fields of study. So here are some sort of early thoughts from our data that we'll be presenting today. We're going to talk about what our data tells us about distance students' backgrounds from the participants in our study in terms of their gender, age, national and disciplinary and institutional affiliations, enrollment status, that kind of thing. We'll share a little bit about what our data tells us about their life circumstances during their doctoral enrollment, their motivations for studying via distance, including their reasons for enrolling for a doctorate, and their reasons for enrolling, particularly, or engaging in distance doctoral study, their experiences of distance supervision, experiences of researcher development, and how the COVID-19 pandemic affected their doctoral journey. And we'll also share some early thoughts from the qualitative elements of our survey. So I'm going to go through these parts fairly quickly, and then I'll hand over to Katrina. So in terms of the gender identity of our respondents from our survey, we had a large majority of women respondents, fewer men, and fewer non-binary participants in our survey. In terms of age, we can see a sort of cluster around the late 20s, early 30s. But I guess there's something to note here that the age range does stretch from 21 to 71, which is something that's important to remember, that our doctoral cohorts are really diverse in terms of their age backgrounds. And yeah, that's something that's really important for us to remember.
And this was their age when they began their doctorate, just so that we had something to compare. This was when they started. So starting a doctorate at 71, like mad respect for those people. But yeah, that really broad spread is very noteworthy.
Thanks, Katrina. In terms of the country of residence, so where participants were when they were undertaking their doctoral study, the spread here, oops, I'm just going to move my box. I'm pretty sure that the large red part down the bottom, which I can't quite see right now, says, can you see that, Katrina?
Yeah, Australasia Pacific.
Thank you. That probably corresponds to the kinds of networks that we animated in order to get our survey out. But we also got some good responses from colleagues in Europe, North America. We had colleagues represented from Africa, Asia and the Middle East, but South America is certainly an area that is not well represented in our survey.
It says 0%. There is a slice there, but it's less than 1% of the data. So very few. It was a hard to reach community for us.
In terms of the backgrounds of our respondents, most of our respondents lived in the same country that they primarily lived in during their doctorates, whereas a smaller amount of participants lived in a country that they lived in for a shorter time during their doctorates, and 10% lived in a different country that they didn't live in at all during their doctorates. So yeah, again, something really helpful to note there.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of assuming that our distance students are overseas, that's not by any stretch the most common thing here, because 84% of people were enrolled at a university that was where they lived in that same country. That was their distance experience. They weren't on another continent from their university. They were living in the same country as the university, but they were not studying on campus.
In terms of the disciplinary affiliation of our survey respondents, again, education was a fairly large grouping at 32%. Again, perhaps reflecting our own disciplinary orientation. We had 21% of our respondents from the social sciences, excluding education, 20% from in the sciences, 18% in the arts and humanities, 4% in business and management, and 5% in engineering, design, and technology. So there's something, I think, interesting to think about here about which disciplines may be more where distance education might be more common. That I think that's something for us to do a little bit more thinking about. But yeah, there's, even though we might not expect some disciplines, lab-based disciplines, for example, to have as much possibility for distance doctoral students, I think what we can see here is, yeah, across a number of different disciplinary backgrounds, people are studying at a distance. In terms of our respondents' backgrounds regarding their current enrollment status, the majority of participants in our survey their study was ongoing. This was something they were still doing. We had 26% of respondents who had already graduated, succeeding, getting that doctorate. And then another group, 6%, who had submitted their dissertation or thesis or were in the process of examination at the time. We had 2% who were on a leave of absence, and a small number of participants who had dropped out or withdrawn from their doctoral programs. In terms of, we asked participants a question about whether this was their first time studying by distance. So for 250 of these participants, that was their first time, but also for quite a large number of respondents, 208, this was not their first time studying by distance. So a number of respondents in our questionnaire, this was already a part of their journey, distance study. So I think that that's also something that's interesting to know. So yeah, I'll hand over to you, Katrina, to share some more about the study.
So yeah, that's a picture of who the students were that responded to our survey. And, it was a self-selected sample. We did our best through networking. So we're not claiming that those percentages are necessarily representative of all distance doctoral students, but the diversity that we see in those characteristics is more about saying, that we've captured a range of experiences to be able to draw some inferences from about what might be within that cohort of distance doctoral students without assuming that that's a directly proportional representative sample. So within that group of 521 students, we asked them, what happened in your life while you were doing your doctorate? You remember Jamie's and my slides with all of the house moves and things. And so we put in a list of all of the things that we could think of. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was imprisoned during their doctorate, but we know that distance doctorates do happen in prison. But a lot of people had a range of life experiences to deal with. The most common were parenting and care responsibilities, that first bar, mental health issues at the other end. That was the top, the most frequently reported experience, that some sort of mental health challenges during the doctorate, and reasonably closely followed by physical health challenges. And then we saw, losing somebody that they loved, significant drop in income, other caring responsibilities, those kinds of things. So another way of looking at the same data was to kind of count how many of those boxes people ticked. Did they have mental health issues and caring responsibilities and a big drop in income, and they moved countries? So how many major life events during the course of their doctorate? And there's quite a spread here. For a lot of people, it was a handful, but there were some who had up to 16 or 15 major life events. And remembering that a lot of our participants were still going with their doctorate, 65% of our sample hadn't finished yet. So this might not be the whole story there either. There might be more ahead. So that's a lot. This is a little word cloud just with some of the words that came through in the qualitative comments that people shared about what went on for them during their doctorate. If you take away, nothing except this from today's talk, I'd be really pleased, because this is just a picture of that complexity and all that people are juggling logistically, in terms of dividing their time and in terms of that mental and emotional load. I think the trope of the full-time unencumbered doctoral student who just closes their door in the kind of halls of academia and works for 4 years on their project is long gone for a large number of students. There are a lot of complex challenges, and that's not a bad thing. I think that that's just part of being human. And so it's important for us to be responsive to that and recognise the humanness of our students and their complex experiences. I've got a quote here. This is one respondent sharing what had happened in her doctorate. So the first thing that happened was, this is an older woman, so her daughter, who had a 1-year-old, was hospitalised in another state and they couldn't visit. So I guess a lot of anxiety around that. She was in the hospital for 7 weeks and then had a really massive diagnosis of a lifelong condition. Then another daughter experienced severe prenatal anxiety and depression. Again, the woman responding to our survey, the doctoral student, couldn't go and be with her, and then that daughter's postnatal period was really difficult, and the baby had health issues. So a number of really major things there. Then both of her elderly parents in and out of hospital, sometimes staying in for up to 5 weeks. Her father broke his neck. He still works at a farm and he couldn't drive, so the doctoral respondent and her sister had to take turns actually living in with the elderly parents to drive them to appointments and help them out. Finally, just over a month ago, my house was flooded up to 50 centimetres of water that stayed that high for about a week, and I lost everything, almost everything: books, documents, furniture, flooring, curtains. The floor fell through in the bathroom. I lost everything outside the house, and the sheds, the backyards, the carport, the caravan, all the furnishings, and any appliance that wasn't up on a bench. And so at the time that she responded to our survey, she still couldn't visit her home. She'd moved in with her adult who had, salvaged a few things, including 2 precious books that had sort of sparked her research. But tremendous financial impact, financially ruined due to not having flood insurance, because it was just simply unaffordable. This woman had been on benefits, pensions, and insurance for flooding had just become unaffordable, and it wasn't something that she could access. So there's this woman who's aspiring and doing something really beautiful and transformative by pursuing higher education, and obviously against some odds. This is the kind of student that we love to see doing a doctorate, but all of this going on. And I just picked this one out of, there are many stories like this that people have shared with us, because in the 3 to 8 year window of your life, a lot of stuff's going to happen for people. Now, zooming out to something a bit perhaps more straightforward, we thought about why are these people doing doctorates, given all that's going on in their lives and things and the different ages. And we found that the reasons here didn't look very different from what we might expect from on-campus doctoral students. The most popular was just that, passion for learning, followed by, wanting to stretch themselves and add to their knowledge and skills for their work, or improve their personal future opportunities, make a difference, always wanted to do a doctorate or become a researcher, those kinds of things. So nothing here was particularly surprising. And so that's noteworthy in itself, that these are a lot like what we would expect on-campus students to be like in terms of why they are in a doctoral program at all. But what was more interesting was the reasons that they were doing their doctorate by distance. The most common was that they didn't live near their institution, and we don't know whether they considered moving and couldn't, or just preferred not to, but they certainly didn't live near their institution. Quite a lot of students just preferred studying by distance, or felt that studying by distance was the best fit for them, or that it was the only way they could make it work. Parenting and employment made it difficult. We allowed people to tick as many of these statements as applied to them. So some students have ticked more than one that they could relate to. And then, of course, there was this big group of students who were only doing their doctorate by distance because of COVID, over 150 of them. And then a group also with other unexpected circumstances. Some of them popped in some comments, but just the doctorate by distance is not always people's plan. I think that's important to recognise. For some people, it's that really crucial enabler, that this is the only way they could do it. Doctorate by distance makes things possible for them. And for others, it's something they find themselves forced into by their circumstances, by global events, by family pressures. What was distance like? The majority, the biggest group, actually lived far away from their institution. So we know that 90% of them were in the same country as their enrolling institution, but they still weren't living, nearby in the same town or something. But then at the top here, there's quite a group who did live physically, geographically close to their institution, but they just chose to do some or all of their doctoral work at home or elsewhere for various reasons, like we saw in the previous slide: caring responsibilities, saving money of travel, paid work. The number who were actually enrolled in an online program was quite small, only 63. I remember we had 521 respondents, so it's only a little bit more than 10%. Most of them, that was not why they were distant students. And I think that's a powerful one for reframing our thinking. When we think about distant students and we associate that with students who are enrolled in an online program, actually 90% of our respondents weren't that. They had these other complexities. The mixed kind of hybrid, some people who did some of their work on campus and some at home, and quite a proportion who would have liked to study on campus. So being by distance was not their preference, but distance wasn't accessible, on campus wasn't accessible for them. So you'll all know, those of you who supervise, that different students that you work with will be experiencing distance differently, and some of them will really like it, and some of them will hate it. Some of them will be trying to avoid it, trying to minimize it, loving a 50-50, different views. We were interested to hear how supervision had been conducted for these students. And so what this graph shows is red is not very often, rarely or never. I'll just move my zoomy things. Never was the word. The orange is that this method was used occasionally, or the green is that this method was used often. So the most common, the ones with the most green and orange, were video conference, so Zoom and Skype and Teams type ways of engaging with supervisors, and that written feedback on drafts and emails of questions. That's not especially surprising, but it was interesting that there were some students who clicked never. So that red one wasn't really, it was never. They never got email or written feedback on drafts as their supervision and input, or they never talked with their supervisors via video conference. A smaller number of students talked to their supervisors by telephone. I don't know, about 33% there, or by a smaller number by instant messaging. That might seem surprising to those of us in, Western countries, I guess, global north, but we know from our colleague Liezel in South Africa that those instant messaging things have been really important for students on the African continent because they're quick and they work on the phone and the mobile data. Some students, second to bottom row here, chose to travel to campus and meet their supervisor face-to-face, either often, not very many students did that often, but a reasonable chunk did that sometimes, occasionally. So about half students chose to travel in at least occasionally and meet their supervisor. Half didn't go in if they didn't have to. The bottom row, there were a proportion here whose supervisors insisted that the student come into campus and meet face-to-face. So for about 4%, that had to happen quite often. And for another 15, 18% occasionally. But obviously a lot of supervisors were willing to work with students via some of these alternative means. We wondered to what extent our distance students had been able to tap into other things besides their supervisor, because we know that students do better when the supervisor is not their only source of development. Quite a lot had participated in research and development type events, academic conferences or symposia, online networks. And some of we don't know whether they were run by their institution or at their institution, or were other things that they had just found online themselves. But they were quite active in, I guess, leading their own learning through participating in those sorts of things. I wonder whether those proportions might even be higher or comparable with on-campus students. I did a lot of learning just by reading, not reading, disciplinary papers, but by reading advice books and articles and blogs about how to write a good literature review, or how to craft a research question, how to do a conference presentation. They were very actively engaged in that advice literature that's out there. So some really admirable traits here of leading their own learning. The COVID pandemic, the largest proportion of our respondents were still working on their doctorate during COVID. So of that group, we asked them about how that affected their distance experience. So a small number of them, you'll remember from an earlier slide, it was COVID that made them a distance student. Others were already distance students and continued that way through the pandemic. So how did COVID impact on their life? The most common by far was one or more periods of lockdown in their communities. For their community, some people had quarantine individually. Employment changes were quite common, knowing people who had COVID, they contracted it themselves. And over here, the experience of fear, anxiety or distress, that mental health impact with all of this going on outside their doctoral work, but affecting them as a person. Like before, we also counted the number of ways people told us that COVID had impacted. As before, just one was the most common, but then there was this spread, people who had quite a lot more. And again, these students, 65% of these respondents were still working on their doctorates, so the story wasn't over yet. How did COVID affect their doctoral study? So we asked them whether a bunch of things got worse as a result of COVID's impacts, or stayed about the same, or got better. So that's the red, orange and green here. Ease of accessing, university staff. A few students said that got better for them. Most students didn't. It stayed the same or it got worse. It got harder to get hold of university staff, resources and support services. But there were some who said it got better, and maybe that's a shift over time as universities got better at figuring out how to do this stuff when we can't have our students on campus. I'm not sure. Ease of engaging with peers, again, was not generally facilitated, but the time they had available and the headspace they had available, some bigger groups of students reporting that got better, but also large groups of students reporting that got worse. Perhaps they now had their children at home more of the time because schools were closed, and so that took away some of the doctoral respondents' time to work on their research. Ability to collect data, do practical work got significantly worse for a lot of students, as it did for on-campus students as well. Timely completion, that was one of the worst ones. Almost 60% felt that their ability to complete their research on time got worse as a result of COVID, and a sizable number saying that they overall felt their doctoral program, their study overall became more difficult. Some of these are not surprising, but it is interesting to see the variation, that in all categories there are students who felt that these things got better for them as a result of COVID, and that's really, really interesting. The survey was intended as a sort of foundational exploratory piece of work because nothing like this had been done for quite a long time. There were some profiles of distance cohorts from places like Australia, but they're quite out of date now. So we wanted to do this broad picture first, get as much information as we could through a survey, but then, you know, you'll all have questions that you're wishing that we knew more about, and that would lend themselves to our next phase with some follow-up interviews or something. Jamie, over to you now for some of these kind of student reflections.
Yeah, I'll scoot through this pretty quickly, Katrina, so we've got time for questions at the end. But we asked some open questions in the survey to gather some impressions from students. And one of the questions we asked was about the barriers that encountered. So what we can see here are a whole host of barriers ranging from time zones of sessions that have been planned, limited opportunities for synchronous induction and orientation sessions, financial barriers, so that being, students needing to stay in full-time employment, barriers around stress and mental health, barriers about a lack of clear institutional policy about whether distance doctoral study is allowed, and what kinds of provisions are put in place for students who do study at a distance. What we can see in our study is that there are a number of students who see themselves as studying at a distance, but maybe their institutions don't even know or don't even see them as distance students. So that's something to note. Barriers around time management, students sort of noting that they can't as easily get swept up in the rhythm of things on a campus. They might not have office mates who are, also working on their upgrade or, other kind of key moments of the doctorate. And other students stating that it was really difficult not being able to switch off, always feeling like they were on, not having those clear boundaries between home and study. Other barriers including limited interaction with doctoral peers, which is a real shame, not knowing how to access resources at a distance, how to access technology, software, resources at the library, that kind of thing. And also barriers around communication with supervisors, challenges with a timely response from supervisors, and the challenge that students can't just pop in, have a sort of sporadic, unplanned meeting with a supervisor, which might lead to more formality in the supervisory relationship. So you can see in this quote over here, the biggest barrier is no one to talk to bounce ideas around, nut out new ways of thinking, which can be a challenge for keeping motivation. I'm doing an ED and I'm still in touch with the students who are my participants. I do it for them. They want me to finish it. Otherwise, I'd have quit ages ago. So again, this is just one story from many in our data. Thanks, Katrina. We also asked a question about the strategies that students were employing. Here are just some of, we've still got to work through this data, but students identifying that being proactive regarding the sort of early stage of the doctorate was really helpful, being proactive in orientation induction sessions to learn systems early and how to read the university at a distance. What it might mean to read a university at a distance is something that I think is interesting. How to, what pockets of support, what pockets of possibility might be available to students. Other strategies included clear divisions between home time and work time, including thoughts about spatial arrangements. Some students were renegotiating responsibilities at home and at work. So some students taking time off work, for example, in order to prioritize their studies. Students reducing work time or compressing their hours, ring fencing their PhD time. Those were strategies students mentioned. Other strategies around community and connection included writing groups, finding community and connection outside of the institution if that was needed. That might include the kind of, social media groups, that kind of thing. And also reaching out to research mentors were other strategies that students noted. So in terms of the successes that our students identified, some other impressions here, we saw students sort of reaching those academic milestones of confirmation, submission, defense, graduation, publications, employment, that kind of thing. Students who were, juggling, multitasking, balancing, being able to do all of these things at once was sometimes a source of pride and agency for some students, being able to kind of squeeze so much into life. And other students had success with their health and well-being, increased opportunities to walk during the day, cook healthy food, increased satisfaction with progress, being able to listen to one's body. These were some other successes that distance students noticed. And another key success was just having access to doctoral study. If online PhD was not an option, there was no way I could do a PhD. I don't think I could have done it any other way. So this idea that distance study can be a real bridge for some students who might not otherwise have access to this form of higher education. Over to you, Katrina.
Thanks, Jamie. So, we've got a lot of analysis still ahead of us, but that's some early impressions from the quant aspects of the survey and some of the themes across that qualitative data. But I guess what would we say to you, recognising that these distance cohorts are complex and diverse, I think that what we'd hope that you take away is questioning the traditional pattern of seeing a distance pathway potentially as second best or as an anomaly, and recognising that might be a deliberate choice for students or the only way that they can engage in doctoral education, and that it can be something really positive. And these things mean that we should be planning for distance students and in all of the variations of what distance might look like. We shouldn't just be planning on one model of who students are and then leaving it to students to make the best of what they can or cannot access. And I think that this is an opportunity. There's sort of moral reasons why it's important for equity and diversity and inclusion, and there's the sort of marketized reasons that institutions that do this well could potentially have a bit of a market edge here, because there's more and more students are going to be wanting to have these flexible ways of enrolling and undertaking a doctorate and being well supported in doing so. So in order for us to be on this journey and make these shifts, it is really important to have a really clear understanding of what distance looks like today, and that will continue to shift as we come out of the pandemic and different things happen. So keeping our ear to the ground, I guess, and listening to the students, who they are, what their experiences are, what their needs are. We think that the best way to cater for distance students is going to be sort of a dual track. We think that there needs to be some provision that's targeted for distance students as a unique community. So it might be things like how reading the university at a distance, talking about some of the time management or the importance of connecting with communities, how to access the technology and the library and the student learning support when you're not on campus. So they do need that bespoke provision, but then we also think it's important that they be mainstreamed into other things and made to feel like they're genuinely part of the whole doctoral cohort, rather than being the group that can never get to things. So how do we redesign, whether it's a 3-minute thesis event or a graduate symposium or induction programs, if they're always at 2 o'clock on a Thursday in a particular campus, who does that exclude and systematically exclude? If the time zones move around and there's recordings and other options, we're less likely to continually systematically exclude the same students. And the last thing that we think is important is actively raising the visibility of our distance students and distance pathways. Certainly my university doesn't have clear information about possibilities for distance doctoral study on its website, for example. I don't know what student learning say, or sorry, what the student services people say when a student applies and asks a question. We don't offer an official online program at doctoral level. So how does that communication happen right from that initial pre-admission inquiry all the way through to how we communicate when we send newsletters to doctoral students, or we talk as a department about our doctoral students? So are we making sure that distance students are visible and celebrated within that? Where to next? We'll continue to work on going deeper into our qualitative data in particular, and so we'll be, working towards a suite of papers from our data, and we really feel it's important to make sure that our work can help doctoral students themselves. So as much as possible, we'll also be doing things like blogging and our findings, writing things that are for students, creating tools and practical resources so that they can hear and learn from the strategies shared by the ones who've responded to our survey. And we're going to keep banging the drum, advocating for this group of doctoral students who don't come to campus all the time. As Jamie said, our book's in preparation. We've got a kind of a messy first draft, and that's on track for publication at this time next year. And you can keep in touch with what we're up to via Twitter, either by our individual handles, by the hashtag, and on our website. You can subscribe to updates on the website if you wish. That's what we had prepared. Thank you very much. We, really very much welcome your questions. I'll have a look at the chat.
Thank you so much, guys. That was absolutely wonderful. Erin has had to leave us because she had to go pick up her kids. But yeah, if you just want to answer questions and continue chatting, as long as you like, I can stay here till 3:30 our time.
Thanks, Eric.
Rukia, did you have a question?
Thank you, Jamie, for calling me out. I would like to congratulate you both for the wonderful presentation and insightful things which came in with the presentation. All the best for the data analysis. One question that I had was, I was wondering what happens to structure if one could argue from the structure point of doctoral education after, let's say, the advanced research method course, even in a full-time program. So the lack of structure which inherently shapes doctoral education then. And in that light, are full-time students very different from the distance students?
That's an interesting question. And we know that, the amount of structure within a doctoral program can vary, especially across contexts. So we know that the American doctorates are much more tightly structured than countries under the British model. I think there's definitely some challenges that all doctoral students face, and that's where, making sure that our distance students aren't excluded from the training and support that tackles those common issues is really important, because all doctoral students, I think, have some danger points around the lack of structure and I'm doing something so big that I've never done before. How can I possibly write myself a timeline and just arbitrarily decide how long it should take me to develop chapter 2 or something? All students need help to learn to work within that kind of poorly defined space. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily different for distance students, except to the extent that they might be excluded from accessing the support that on-campus students might have, whether that's a workshop or just you walk into the staff room, you're making a cup of tea, and you see somebody, whether it's your supervisor or another doctoral student or just another staff member, and they say, how's it going? And you say, oh, I'm just a bit anxious and lost, and I'm not really sure if I'm on track or not. And they just gift you this nugget of, oh, this is what it was like for me. And you have that spontaneous, informal learning moment that helps you perhaps, here's something that I read that helped me, or this is what I used to do, or it's okay because that's a normal part of the experience and you'll get there. How do we make sure that the distance students are still able to access the learning and support? It might need to happen in a more structured way through some, newsletters, videos, clips, trainings, whatever, Facebook communities where they can ask questions. But I think the underlying challenge in that particular case is not different, but their access to the kind of support that helps them meet that particular challenge of doctoral study might be a difference. What do you think, Jamie?
Yeah, I'm wondering, Arukia, is your sort of question around access to particular learning opportunities? Like, are you talking about sort of coursework, that kind of thing? Did you have an idea in mind about what the students might be missing out on?
The distance students might
Yeah.
be missing out on. The community support,
Yeah.
one.
Yeah.
And as you presented, the access to, let's say, or even the option that such an availability is available to them, and they could go and access the institution, as Katrina was rightly pointing out that she walked physically into her university when she was graduating.
Yeah.
That kind of experience. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we're interested in is how can we create those kinds of spaces for distance students too. Like there are opportunities to create the kind of convivial spaces that Katrina was sort of talking about, the spaces where we sort of bump into each other. We can do some of that on social media. We can find ways to bring all students into community, and not all of that has to be in the meet space, as people say. Some of it can be in in online spaces as well. So I think that that's something that we're really interested in.
I think there are also benefits of students building networks that go beyond the institution. On-campus students, because they have more easy access to other students at their place and other staff at their place, those can become their core networks, which works really well for the period of the doctorate. But then if they move to a different institution or a different role somewhere else, their networks don't necessarily come with them. But students who have been at distance and perhaps have needed to find other networks. So none of my networks were at my institution because there was no way for me to access anything at my institution. All my networks were through online groups, social media, women in academia kind of stuff. So those networks have continued to be just as available and helpful to me no matter where I've been. And when I left my doctorate and moved into my first academic role, the networks came with me. So I think that's an advantage. We want, of course, it's helpful for students to interact within our institution, but we can also encourage them to engage in wider communities, because what matters is that they have community.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm in a department where we've been talking about different modes of delivery for our programs. And one of the issues that emerges a lot is around overall quality of the experience, and wondering, in fact, if a doctoral degree should ever be a degree that can be completed fully at a distance. And University of Toronto being a little bit of a snob in terms of thinking, you know, that we do things maybe better than the rest, many colleagues and students would say that you're not really getting a U of T degree unless you come and spend at least some time being in situ learning, interacting with peers in that space. So certainly what I see as a, you know, an administrator and a senior professor is a lot of pushback against fully distance or online programming. And that's one of the reasons, but there is a whole host of other ones in terms of reputation, in terms of standards and control of quality and so on. What are, like, did you have any of your respondents who said that they were concerned that they were getting less or not enough, or in terms of the quality and their expectations of what a doctorate was supposed to be all about?
That didn't come through as a strong kind of message. I mean, this is still early impressions from just, you know, reading through the data. I think people can see that things could be better, but I think they feel that things could be better rather than it not being possible. I think students have also probably been made to feel that it's on them if they're distance students, so they haven't necessarily got that critical view to say, hold on, I pay as many fees as these other people and my university's not supporting me as well. That the survey respondents didn't kind of reveal that critical stance that I'm a group with entitlements and I'm not getting an equitable provision. But there was certainly a desire for more, but within the bounds of the very good reasons why they were distance students in the first place. I think there'll always be a few students who could go either way, and yes, they could come to your institution if you made them. But if that's the policy, I think we have to, honestly recognise that is going to exclude a bunch of students. And if the philosophy of the institution is, as you said, to fairly elite and this is how we do things, and if this is not for you, go somewhere else, like that might be the stance. But it's recognising that does by definition exclude a number of students for whom distance is the only option that they could or would consider. And so there's an opportunity to become a leader and do distance excellently and be elite in that space rather than not being in that space. That's my thought. Jamie?
Yeah, just to really echo what you were saying, Katrina, and also to sort of recognise that people who study by distance might be doing it for, reasons of, caring responsibilities, disability, all kinds of reasons. And if we want to ensure that our doctoral cohorts are as diverse and inclusive and representative as we can make them, then this kind of bridge might be really important for some of those groups. So yeah, I hear the argument, and I sometimes hear it, around the communities that I'm in too, around what's the best form of doctoral provision that we can offer our students, and is this it? And I think it's okay to ask those questions, but I think it's also, and I think what we're trying to do in this project is, like Katrina said, how can we mainstream some of the inclusive options so that students who are already studying at a distance and maybe just aren't recognised as such or are sort of hidden within the institution can have as much access to these kinds of opportunities as we can as we can make it. And offering these to distance students can also be really helpful for students who aren't at a distance, but yeah, who have other kinds of things going on in their lives that mean that accessing something online or getting a recording or that kind of thing makes it much more possible for them to participate. So
yeah, I think the pandemic taught us lots of good lessons about how to make ourselves more accessible as learning spaces. And I see that that's really bleeding into sort of our post-pandemic era, that people do think differently, and they are thinking about not only all of the people in the categories that you've identified, but also a new category of the perhaps more cautious or frail individual, both the professor and the student, who are still not comfortable being on campus. That's a group that we think about a lot and that we don't want to be excluding.
And there's people that, you know, they have that kind of medical concern that they don't feel safe in terms of the virus being on campus. But, you know, another strand of my research is around people who live with the effects of trauma and are engaged in higher education. And social spaces can be really overwhelming and scary. And it can be a space where people are cruel and unkind without necessarily meaning to be, but it feels unsafe. And so students don't go for those sorts of reasons too. So even if you have the policy that they have to be enrolled and they have to be living here, I imagine that there'll be some students who are more engaged and some who are more withdrawn and choose not to come along. And so I guess we haven't said it explicitly, but you know, implicit in doing this survey is that we should listen to these students. And so I think that that's also a really important part of the way forward, to talk to, as I'm sure you are, talk to your current students about how they experience these activities that are on campus and how that pressure makes them feel. Like, do they find that a really helpful draw? Is there a subgroup of students for whom that's really intimidating and frightening and they resist it? And, you know, can you get enough trust for them to tell you why and partner with them to co-construct something that might meet their needs, and think about what the possibilities might be for students who just don't, for a range of reasons, including that medical anxiety, trauma, wellbeing, mental health, and the situational stuff that we've looked at, they don't feel comfortable or able to be present physically on campus some or all of the time. Really interesting space for you as an institution, thinking about, you know, how do you reinvent, or do you reinvent, or do you kind of unashamedly hold on to these are our ways and there are other places that offer other things and we'll do this, and, you know, if you want to go somewhere else, go there, but this is what it'll be like here. Interesting. And just thinking about the moral positioning of those choices.
Well, it's interesting, Katrina, as you talk, there's also another group that is at the opposite end. We have students who have told us that they have suffered a great deal with distance learning that was forced upon them because of their particular, you know, person, who they are. They may have particular learning difficulties that make learning from a distance overwhelming. So it's really a complex situation when you're trying to accommodate such a wide range of needs among a potential student population. But
Yes.
I appreciate the work and thank you. Like some others, I'm afraid I have to abscond for another meeting.
No, great to chat with you.
Thank you so much. Are there any final questions, perhaps? Maybe not.
Emma, did you want to say anything? I know you said you didn't, but yeah, thank you for being here and listening in. Any reflections or?
Yes, yeah, thank you for letting me come along. That was really cool to see yeah, how you both have worked together and used the survey and that type of thing to collect all your data, and yeah, were you going to take it from there as well with your findings? It's really cool to see how it's all come along. Yeah.
And lots of your work in there. Emma put together all the graphs and, you know, a deck of slides from the quant data and stuff for us, which has been so great. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, thank you.
Alison, back to you, I guess.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation and a really good chat afterwards.